Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
Thinking about the idea that history is an illusion, it's fabricated, and it's a dangerous thing, but we see it every day in our newspapers and we see it in our textbooks. So it's something that I think historians contest with very well.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 70, where we can all kick back and let that sweet Social Security money roll in. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Michael Zapata about his book, The Lost Book of Adana, Moreau. Michael Zapata is the author of The Lost Book of Adana, Moreau. He is a founding editor of the award-winning Make literary magazine. He's also the recipient of an Illinois Arts Council Award for Fiction, the City of Chicago DCASE Individual Artist Program Award, and a Pushcart nomination. As an educator, he taught literature and writing in high schools, servicing dropout students. He is a graduate of the University of Iowa and has lived in New Orleans, Italy, and Ecuador. He currently lives in Chicago with his family. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. I am your host, John Monaster. Super excited to be here with you today. I'm going to be discussing the book, The Lost Book of Adana, Moreau, with author Michael Zapata. Michael, say hello.
Hey, how's everyone doing? Thank you for joining us, and thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited.
Yeah. No, I'm excited to have you. This was a really fascinating book, and as kind of obviously just a lover of books in general, but also kind of a sci-fi nerd and many other things, this book really hit a bunch of great touch points for me. So
wonderful.
Yeah, totally. So why don't we just kick it off? I always like to ask, just, in your own words, what's this book all about? Tell us about it.
Yeah, so Lost Book of Adana Moreau essentially is about a Dominican woman in 1916 who gets exiled to New Orleans. She writes this cult classic science fiction novel. She writes a sequel before she passes away. From a typhoid epidemic during the Great Depression, she destroys the sequel. In the year 2000, in the year 2004, 2005, a hotel concierge in Chicago finds the sequel in his grandfather's things after his grandfather passes away, with sort of a final wishes to deliver it to a theoretical physicist called Maxwell Moreau. So essentially, the story itself becomes a literary mystery, but throughout, it sort of weaves together the histories of Latin America, Eastern Europe, and the United States through the 20th and early part of the 21st century. And I'd like to think of it as like a historical literary mystery. Yeah. And if I had to sum it up in one word, I would say it's essentially about exiles throughout history.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, one of the big things you do is have all the different characters tell their story of being exiled or their travels as they, had to deal with that. So, yeah, I think that's a great point.
Yeah, and I always look at it like, especially with characters who are introduced and playing with the structure a lot as far as stories. I had previously, before even writing a lot of fiction, I had previously wrote for the stage. And it was really important to me that when you have stories and stories, or you have all these stories of exiles, to give characters sort of their time and space in the book, even if it's just for a few pages. So I really, really look at it as almost like sometimes like a cacophony of voices that come from exile is another way to look at it, I think.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So I think that kind of leads in. I always like to kick it off with more questions about the creative process and the way you were thinking about putting the book together before we really get into the content. And the way you were just talking, you really do have so many different stories within the book from the different characters, and it's just fiercely non-linear, and you're jumping back and forth and around, and really keeping people on their toes. And so that's a really challenging format, I'm sure, to write, but also for readers to read
Yeah.
and think through. So, why did you decide that was sort of the best way to tell this story?
Yeah. Oh, such a good question. And as far as the process of writing, I really kind of took the entire book. The first draft of the book is sentence by sentence, sort of this accidental sort of process of exploration. Laszlo Krasnorkai has this like great quote. I'm going to mangle it right now, but it's essentially the moment by moment necessity of nature. Going through it sentence by sentence. But as this sort of structure emerged, it felt most comfortable for me. I'm Latinx and biracial. My mother's family is from Lithuania. They're Jewish heritage, and my father's from Ecuador. And so when I think about the process by which to tell stories, it always kind of pulled from those two traditions, not only like sort of dinner table talk traditions when families tell stories, but also the literary traditions that can be quite discursive and can quite be stories and stories. And so, so when I think about the structure, the novel emerged, and I think the only way that it could be told for me, and it felt the most comfortable for me. I don't know if I thought about planning structure so much as this is the way I've heard stories my entire life, coming from those two literary traditions and narrative traditions, oral traditions, from my family. And so like people have asked me that, and I say this was the most comfortable way for me to tell this story.
Oh, okay. Well, that's important.
Yeah.
You're the writer.
Yeah.
You want to make it as easy as possible to do this incredibly difficult thing.
Well, and I think definitely when the process itself can be extraordinarily challenging and difficult, and having it make sense for yourself first. And, if I have to think about the structure, more to the overtures of it, I in some ways, when I went back after the first draft, I got really excited about this idea of taking sort of Latin American literary traditions, which, stemming from Don Quixote all the way up until Bolaño and the post-boom, and is very much about a nonlinear structures. I really admire that about so many writers in Latin America. And then the American tradition is sort of masterful when it comes to structures. We sort of inherit from the Victorians, we inherit through film, and just this extraordinary way to get from point A to point B. And I thought that those two would be fun to sort of collide together if possible, and see if it would work or not. It was kind of a big experiment when I started thinking about structure more.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, I also think that's sort of how new structures are birthed, right? It's that you're bringing all these different traditions together and kind of creating your own. So yeah, that's scary. So,
and it was also, I think, growing up first generation in the United States, I think that's why I referred to it as being comfortable, because it was constantly throwing traditions together and then seeing what's going to happen.
Yeah, sure. Melting pot. Makes sense. And the book takes place all over the place, really, as you mentioned, but some of the main locations are kind of this, post-Katrina New Orleans, and Chicago is another big location in the book. And, having read a little bit about you, these are places that you have lived.
Yeah.
And, I'm always interested to think about that, as a writer, having lived in these locations. How much of that did you bring with you? How much did that inform you? How did you use the time you had spent physically in these locations to help the characters navigate their worlds?
Such a good question. I think, I spent most of my life in Chicago. I was born and raised in Chicago. And so it's always been, the sort of the Uber space I've inhabited for most of my life. But I became really kind of obsessed with New Orleans at an early age. The first time I went to New Orleans, I was 20, and I've ended up returning, 2 or 3 times a year until I had moved there for some time. And I thought of Chicago and New Orleans sort of not only as sister cities, but also sort of like a port for exiles throughout American history, and inhabiting those spaces as an immigrant or first generation or exile communities was not only like pretty extraordinarily interesting for me, but it was also part of my own personal narrative. And not only was it my own experience growing up in Chicago with immigrant communities, but looking at these spaces that are created quite quickly within cities. You have immigrant communities that within 20, 30 years have sort of foundational origin stories in a new country. And I was very interested in how that has worked throughout the 20th century. And so I found, when writing about New Orleans, writing about Chicago, I found these parallels between them both, of course. But sort of the fun, sort of the craft and the fun and the research behind it was forcing myself to dig into the actual historical record. And when I did that, when I first started writing this novel, I did struggle with how do you write from a historical place, and how much information is too much or too less, or how do you sort of navigate a space that you don't know intimately yourself. And I really found that one of the best things I could do was look at the oral tradition of both cities. It wasn't until I started reading the firsthand oral traditions of both cities that they felt suddenly very intimate. To hear the actual words of people throughout the Great Depression, and even a little bit earlier in New Orleans, during the time period when the Dominicana Adana Moreau was exiled, to read those. And I went to historical museums in both cities and really sat down with the oral traditions. And that's what not only blew my mind that those records were there and available, but how beautiful and tragic and also very domestic a lot of the stories were. And it wasn't until then that I felt intimate with the place through history.
Yeah, that's incredible. I think that's a really interesting way of obviously doing research. I mean, you just went straight to the source. What did you mean when you say domestic?
Yeah, so you would have these. I particularly remember looking at some records in Chicago, and I was looking sort of at the Pale Jewish settlement, which is featured a little bit in the novel. And so we had these like Jewish oral traditions, and the individuals explaining these crossings from Europe to the United States and how difficult and how painful it was, and then family members they lost, and almost within the same breath, they would just talk about being in the kitchen, the foods they would cook, or an argument that they would have with a cousin. It was like, it was like these very like tragic or difficult stories, and then within a breath, people would turn it into domestic family fights and fun times they had in the kitchen during. And it was amazing to me that the human memory worked that way. And could move so quickly through their own story in those ways.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, so this is like a perfect entree into my first question in terms of the content of the book, which is, thinking about the characters in this book. I mean, the things that happen to the characters, I mean, it is just incredible. The tragedy and loss they go through in some of the stories that are told, and the happiness and the excitement, they're people lose parents, relatives constantly. There's death, but there's also, extreme excitement and reconnection and finding people, and people go searching, people find each other, solve problems together, connect. People are you're following Katrina, and people are rescuing people. So it's these incredible highs and lows, and of course, just that, and then just the mundane, where we have, Javier and Saul just chit-chatting about the world, and that's what friends do. And so to me, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that really does seem to be to some degree reflected with the characters. And I was curious about kind of how they were able to deal and respond with that ebb and flow, with those kind of horrible tragedies, with those highs, and then just with carrying on with their lives. How do they think about that?
Yeah. And I think, I remember thinking at some point while in the process of writing this book, and it's in the book itself, there's a historian whose name is Benjamin. He's predominantly when he's a child in the Great Depression, we follow him, and he's Saul's grandfather, who passes away very early on in the novel. And he does say in the novel, he says, every telling of an event is a portrait of the teller and not the event itself. And I really took that really took that idea to heart, and it's an idea I pulled straight from the tradition of Studs Terkel here in Chicago, who was just an enormously amazing oral historian who collected so many oral stories in Chicago and throughout. For anyone listening, if they're not familiar with Studs Terkel, please pick him up. he's
definitely.
He's just so extraordinary. But that idea itself of when you give people space and time on stage, so to speak, to not only tell about the events in their lives, but also it's through the telling of those events that they're able to make sense of who they are. And when you have these characters, I think, going through tragedy, when you have these characters who are sort of contesting and talking about the difficult things in their lives, the one thing I wanted to make very clear, if possible, was that they were still painting a full portrait of themselves and not just the event. When we look at the historical record, or when we look at what journalists write, it's the event, to some chagrin to the victims of any tragedy, and to some chagrin of like actually trying to have this face as a reader when we're reading about these events in the newspaper. But for these characters to go through these events, that's not only who they are. When you grow up in an immigrant community, it's not just the tragedies, and it's not just the exile. It's this full portrait of people living their lives. So it makes me very excited to hear that came across to you as a reader, because the last thing I would want readers to pull from anything would be this sense that all we're dealing with is characters of tragedy.
Right. No, it's the idea is that people are people, and this is life.
Yeah.
This is the way this works, is that there will be highs and lows, but you need to get through them, and you need to exist and connect, and just be people to each other. I think that's what you were talking about.
Yeah, and Studs Terkel had this thing which I also took directly from, called Vox Humana, which was the human voice. He kind of thought of his collective work as the human voice, and I always took that to heart, because he was someone who was able to really pull extraordinary stories from people and give them the space to paint a portrait of themselves.
Yeah. One thing I want to think about, we've already talked a little bit about history here, but like you said, this book is so much about history, and you did a bunch of research about history, and you mentioned that quote about, the telling of a story is a reflection of the teller. And, one thing that I really was interested about was the idea that when Saul's grandfather talking about how, history and truth have nothing to do with each other. I really, that line, and you start thinking about these things, and because I feel like we're so connected to the idea that, when we're in school growing up, there is a history book, we take history class, and the things in that history book are the things, and that is what we must memorize, and, ta-da.
Yeah.
And that's the way of the world. And, it's just interesting to think that, this book, there's so many people, there's so many histories flowing within one another, and there are memories and stories being told, and sometimes it's not always clear the extent to which they're full and accurate. And for example, with Javier, in the entire book, there's kind of this this unsettling these two friends, Javier and Saul. There's this unsettling thing where Saul is trying to understand, because it seems like Javier is holding something very dramatic back from him in terms of his history. And more, more and more comes out. But so I guess I'm just curious about that phrase, that thought, the idea that history and truth are sort of maybe destined to be enemies to some degree. So I'm just wondering, how can we think about history in that regard? Because we've got, on the one hand, like I said, that idea of history is history books, and this is what's there. But on the other hand, of course, this idea history is written by the winners. And, it's obviously there is no one true history. So how do we process that?
That's such a demanding question, I think, is relevant to 2020 right now, as histories are erased and created.
Yeah, exactly.
And coming from this tradition, I found that historians, especially, post World War I and post World War II, absolutely were really looking at more of the function of history and what the historical record can tell us. And Benjamin, the character who says this, comes from a tradition in Eastern Europe where countries disappeared and appeared within a couple years. or a few decades. And so you have, refugees from Eastern Europe and from the Pale Jewish settlements of Russian Empire. You have them very much living in this sort of unstable reality, this unstable sovereignty in which history disappeared and reappeared quite quickly, depending on who was writing it. It was extraordinary to go through that record and see post-World War I how many countries existed and disappeared within a couple of years. And you had people who still had families and communities, and the people they loved within the same towns and within the same cities. And they were living in this extraordinarily unstable realism. And so the idea that history itself becomes not only malleable because of nationalism, but becomes a weapon of sorts to disappear people or to make people appear who previously had not existed in the historical record. When you think of fascism, just previously World War II and then obviously in World War II, it's this extraordinary ebb and flow of what reality was supposed to mean for people. And so a lot of those refugees, a lot of those exiles who came to the United States and the ones who did become historians, the ones who became teachers in high schools and universities, I think there was this enormous push in sort of the field of history to consider the fact that for many history was a lie. The history books that they did pick up were created within a year or two and then sort of dispersed throughout nations that only existed for a few years. To contest with that, I think almost would have felt like it was impossible. And we see that today. We see that even in the textbooks. And I love that you brought up textbooks because I taught high school for some years. We see it in the textbooks that are dispersed from, we have a lot of textbooks companies in Texas. And so the historical record that is being dispersed throughout the nation from these companies who, interestingly enough, sort of paint history in this overtly nationalist or simplistic ways, erasing entire peoples within a few pages is sort of catastrophic. One of the things that I did as a high school teacher, I taught English and I taught film, but definitely when I was in the realm of teaching English, I never used a textbook for exact reasons. Thinking about the idea that history is an illusion, it's fabricated, and it's a dangerous thing, but we see it every day in our newspapers and we see it in our textbooks. So it's something that I think historians contest with very well.
Right, but for some reason that doesn't, I feel like that message doesn't really get transmitted beyond that group, or it's very hard for people to accept that fact. People want to hold on to that. This is the narrative, and this is therefore the truth, and then now this is how I base my further knowledge on the world. And so it's sort of like walking on. In reality, we're sort of all walking on kind of quicksand to some degree, and that idea is very uncomfortable.
It's so uncomfortable, and it gets even more sort of catastrophic and terrifying when you think about that. I mean, like, nationalism creates its own reality, and in that creation, it fabricates history to such an extent that, like you said, we're walking on quicksand. There's this unstable reality to it. I also think when it becomes particularly dangerous when you look at these historical records is that not only do some of us feel like we're walking on quicksand, but I think for a lot of people, they feel like they're walking on the hard cement of reality. They sort of take on the skin and they take on the culture of the state. There was this Argentine journalist who, and I'm paraphrasing, and part of it is in the book, who had said something along the lines of that there are people in any given government, in any given country, that takes on the skin of the state. And that was a very terrifying thought to me, that people could not distinguish themselves and their own desires and wishes for themselves than the desires and wishes for the state. And it's terrifying to me because that is one of the core cultural sort of artifacts of fascism, and how that works. And it is terrifying that history is fiction and illusionary. And I agree with you that one of the biggest things that I think about all the time, but not only as a writer, but as someone who taught high school for so long, is why is that message lost when we enter the classroom when it's fifth graders or 10th graders?
Yeah.
I think that's a huge
Well,
challenge.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it can be one of the, I mean, to some degree, it's that I think we undersell, or I don't know, we don't give kids enough credit, basically. I think that we definitely assume that children are just not smart enough, and we're just going to tell them things, and they write them down, and let's move on. And of course, education is kind of a mess because of that in many ways.
And in my experiences, the most the most attuned people with the BS sensor are 17-year-olds. They know that adults are lying to them before the adults know that they're lying to themselves.
Sure.
Yeah.
That was a great tangent. I'm gonna slightly connect back to this idea of history and the idea of history and truth with kind of a bit of the sci-fi element that starts to get brought into the book, which is, so there's the first novel of Adana Moreau that does get published, right, The Lost City. Then there's this second novel, A Model Earth, and the manuscript from that and the fact that it wasn't published is a big part of the story of the book, is trying to get that there. But you tell a story, and this story has huge ramifications for the rest of the book, in that it causes, so that the idea is that there's this kind of infinite number of parallel Earths in this story, and you connect it to, quantum mechanics and some of this physics and these ideas. And so, we find out that Maxwell Moreau was, had read and understood this and was pondering this, and then Saul, finds out this story and then reflects on this. And so I think one of the most interesting things that you did here when you talked about this sort of like, to some people is like this arcane kind of physics stuff, it's just like, whatever, great, there's infinite worlds. Like, okay, I need to, I got to get to work. I think what you did, and I think what's really interesting, is that you, throughout the book then, after this point was raised, you peppered in the thought process that I think normal people might have with this information, which is that, I'm actually going to reflect on what that means. What does that mean for history? If, in fact, what the narrative that at least I think happened here, happened a billion different ways in all these other places. And, especially for someone like Saul was sitting there reflecting on the fact, his parents died in a very tragic way.
Yeah.
And he thinks about, well, so there are some places where they're not dead, and gets excited by that. But he also, I think, even kind of doubles down on the fact that, wait, this means that they've died over and over and over again in all these other places. And, I think throughout the book, like I said, you sort of pepper in those thoughts about, what does that mean? What are the ramifications of that? Yeah. And I think that's really, truly fascinating to me, because I think that's not a connection that is made between science and our lives. And I think that's what gives a lot of people pause when they want to understand science or think about science. People don't really dive into it so much, because they're sort of like, great, like, we're building the Large Hadron Collider, and we're going to find a new molecule, but like, how does that affect me? And so this is a direct kind of like, hey, this could affect you in this way. We're going to think about this. And so, how and this is real stuff. I mean, you're talking about actual real physics, things that could actually be the case. And so I guess what sort of thought process there is sort of, I mean, first off, I think it's fascinating you even went into that, and maybe you could talk a little bit about, your interest in that and why maybe you've pondered that sort of thing.
The concept itself and looking at the science behind it, it was ridiculed in the 1960s and 70s. And what has emerged over the past 40 years, just in the realm of theoretical physics, is that the mathematical models support it. And also there is the models behind what's called like an inflationary expanding universe supports it as well, which essentially means that if the universe is expanding even beyond the speed of light, then it expands in other it can expand to the extent where there would be other universes and expand so much and so quickly that you'd have doppelgangers. You would have parallel Earths. And so the physics behind it becomes very complicated, and it becomes very real when mathematical models, produce it. What that leaves us for when I'm trying to rush to work, where I'm, trying to feed my children, is this concept of, I think Saul in particular really views it as absolutely terrifying and absolutely beautiful to consider possibilities, and even to consider the quantum realm in which each decision you make has repercussions in another universe. Javier, who's a journalist and who's more of a materialist, he says in the novel that we only have this one Earth. You only have this one reality that you're contesting with, and the one decisions that you make. I think it's the tension between those things that can create almost like an ethical, philosophical framework for people to view their own lives and consider the decisions they make maybe more than they ever would previously. I always laugh because my great grandmother, who I knew, who was just extraordinary, and she was a refugee from Eastern Europe. I knew her when I was 13. She would always call me, there's a Yiddish phrase called Luftmensch, which means your head is in the clouds. It also means someone who is more poetically, when she wasn't like being hilariously insulting. It also meant that clouds of possibility. You're always of the various possibilities in front of you, which is absolutely the work of a poet or a novelist, of course. But, in our day-to-day lives, I think it has extraordinary consequences in the same way that the theory of relativity did. Einstein's theory of relativity is probably in the 20th century had the most profound impact in our domestic lives, more than any other theory in physics since or previously, because it sort of altered the way that we view others. All of a sudden you have historical records that are considering others. There's not sort of this crass sort of neoclassical way to view the world where my reality is the only reality. What I think theoretical quantum physics, and when you're considering parallel universes, I think what that does for us as individuals is it can be quite profound in the way that we think about our own decisions. And also as a nation, when you look at catastrophic climate change, for an example, and I think science fiction and sci-fi is doing extraordinary jobs painting these portraits of what could be, and there's an urgency to it that is even heightened, even more than the Cold War. There's this urgency of how are we going to handle these very real, very visceral problems, and we get one shot at it. But in that process, by thinking about all the various ways in which the Earth can become different Earths, I think it can give us not only philosophical pause, but also very material pause. How are we going to materially contest with this new Earth that's just in front of us? And there's a tension between that. There's a tension between the one life we get to live and then the many that we could live, that I just found fascinating. Even when I was done writing the book, I'm constantly thinking about the decisions I'm making, small ones and big ones, that could sort of unfold and manifold in various ways. It has given me, by the process of writing this book, I think like an ethical framework in which to consider my own course of action and sort of plans.
That's really interesting. I mean, I guess that's interesting to hear you say that, because I feel like sometimes I try to avoid, to some degree, I try to avoid like a what if kind of mindset, right?
Yeah.
Where I don't want to second guess myself too much. I feel like I want to obviously have a moral and ethical framework that guides my life and make decisions based on that. But at the same time, for me, I feel like you could kind of get stuck in a loop forever of,
Absolutely.
Okay, let's see. What if I had, when I was 10 and I had to write what I wanted to be when I grow up, like what if I wrote something different? Would I have then changed? Like, so it's interesting to hear you say that. And I wonder, obviously we can all get into that headspace, I think,
absolutely.
of the what if and how could things have been changed. And that's sort of, I don't know, to me that feels very naturally human. It just seems like something we do without thought.
Correct. And in the process of it too, I there's this amazing scientific fact that the hippocampus in our brain is largely a place that helps organize and retrieve memory. And there have been some recent studies too that have demonstrated that it is also one of the original places where we access prediction and imagination. And so it becomes that this idea that your own historical record, your own memories become tethered to what you can or can't imagine. And I thought about that in terms of, pulling it back to the book. I thought about that in terms of what that means for immigrant communities and what that means for communities of exile, in which you're in a new country, you're learning a new language, and you're forced to an extent to ask that question, what if? Much more so than maybe people have been in that country for some time, because the decisions that you make have catastrophic impacts. And not only that, but the decisions that are made for you by systems of oppression. So you're constantly considering your actions in terms of what if. At the same time, you're pulling and you're tethered from a historical memory, oftentimes tragedy, and you're trying to imagine what a new life would be in the United States. So I found that, growing up first generation, I found that while researching, the record of first immigrants and exiles, that was a theme that came up again and again and again, not only tethered to the historical record and the tragedy, but trying to imagine a new life. That's sort of the part of the American story that we so often hear is how do we imagine a new life in this place that's still tethered to an enormous amount of tragedy. So the idea of parallel universes not only made sense to me, that someone who was an exile would consider the horrific ramifications of it, and also the beauty that can be sort of embedded in it. But I also think one of his life is at a standstill when we meet him early on in the novel, and I think part of the reason that it's in a standstill is because he doesn't know how to make a new life in this country, even though he's been there for some time. Yeah, I think with Saul, I think he's just not only at a standstill in his life, but he's absolutely fascinated and attracted to science fiction because it offers him views of those what ifs. And I think that's why many of us who are science fiction readers are just like on a very, very like almost primal state, like that curiosity and sort of those questions as far as how can life be different. I also think what science fiction does exceptionally is that it's like literature on the offensive. It absolutely addresses some of our biggest fears and mistrusts with maybe the biggest held values of any civilization or society. It makes us question the material function, and sort of the philosophical function of how our society works. And the best science fiction, I think, attacks that directly and is not shy about it, which is one of the reasons I've always have been so attracted to it. Not only for those questions of what if, but that it attacks our deepest held beliefs, and that's what literature can do. I think.
Right. I think that's the whole point. You should be trying to be challenged. I mean, obviously, sometimes you just want to read a book for fun and
absolutely
be on the beach and not worry about it. But yeah, I agree that probably the best stuff, the stuff that's getting the awards, the stuff people are talking about, is the stuff that really challenges our core beliefs, makes us think differently. So, one thing I want. This is all making me think about in terms of the idea of what if. How could things be different, especially around like immigrant communities, but just generally. One of the things that you talk a lot about in the book in terms of the different stories that are told is not just the idea of exiles and the travels, and the journeys they take, but about revolutions and protests. This comes up a lot, as well as disaster, right? So, you have the February Revolution story. You have the Argentinazo. Once we find out what Javier was actually involved in. That there's the Hurricane Katrina stuff. So there are these kind of what ifs where people, when it comes to revolutions and protests, they're sort of like, well, what if, what if things were better? What if I didn't have to be oppressed, or, what if I wasn't hungry every day or whatever it might be. And or what if I was allowed to withdraw money from my bank,
Yeah.
or whatever. So, people went through these what ifs and actually decided that things were not okay and they needed to band
Hmm.
together and fight back and push back and change things. And I think that that was a big message throughout the book, in the sense that we heard these stories from all over the world, all these different time periods where that did happen. And so, I guess I'm just curious to know, thinking about kind of the tipping point there, when we
Hmm.
think about the what ifs individually, and then people start to come together and talk about the what ifs, how do we think about those moments where it tips over into a protest or a
Yeah.
revolution, or even maybe how a disaster can lead to that or something? And so how can I guess, what did you want the reader to try and understand about those moments?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. And, I always think of like there's very seminal moments, not only in history, but in our lives, in which the past and the future collide in the present.
Mm.
Um, and it's also somewhat taken to physics, but I also think it's very intimate and also very historical at the same time, in the sense where what are the material historical conditions that create inequity, and also create oppression, and what is at any given moment the possibility for a better life. And I think when those two concepts collide in the present, you often have historical periods of protest and revolution. There's this recognition, that not only that the future could be better, but it could be better if we address the exact material inequities of the past.
Yeah.
And I think that when you have a movement, the February Revolution, for example, there's this absolutely massive reckoning that capitalism was failing millions, not unlike how we hear things today. But not only that it had been failing, but the material ways in which it had been failing them, it was working perfectly for the wealthy and for the owner class. But to have a process by which to understand how it was set against them and to imagine a better future at the same time, I think was part of the process why we had the February Revolution. As the book explores too, sort of the Argentine Great Depression in the beginning of the 21st century, 1999 to 2001, 2002, you had a similar process going on where, the Argentine government was very much adopting and has this sort of neoliberal tendency where we're going to privatize a lot of public goods, public works. And people, again, they had this material process by which they understood how their lives were being addressed. Why they go to the bank account and there's nothing, or the banks are frozen, or they're having less and less access to health resources. And then to imagine that it doesn't have to be like that is so profound for the individual, and I think it's profound for society. And I think oftentimes that erupts into movements or revolutions. I feel very strongly that that's what's happening in the political spectrum today in the United States, where people are recognizing, like I said previously, even domestically, my day-to-day life is harder, and I'm noticing that that's the case for the people closest around me. And why, and how can I understand the historical record, and how can that be different in the future? It's so interesting to me, and so profound how groups of people and masses of people can almost collectively decide to change. I think it's one of the most interesting things about humans and sort of our human.
Sure.
Yeah. And so I think when we're dealing with that, a lot of what I wrote about in the book was how that was a direct react. The book itself is not overtly economically political, but people recognizing that capitalism was disenfranchising them very viscerally and very immediately. And then what is our response to that, if anything?
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting to think about what's happening today, and just in the sense that compared to, say, like the February Revolution, for example, obviously there was no internet, right? I mean,
Yeah,
people,
yeah, yeah.
this message of things aren't working, things could be different. Let's get out there and change and make change for ourselves. This was spread from neighbor to neighbor, or whatever. This wasn't there wasn't a Twitter where people could rapidly
Absolutely.
exchange messages, and so this is why today things are just kind of ratcheted up in that manner. So it's kind of interesting to think about the way in which that revolution can happen or not in a
and
different way.
Yeah, in this sort of like war of messaging. I remember reading a short biography of Jensen. I'm forgetting his first name, but the individual who invented the electric loudspeaker. And he went around the country, the United States, early 20th century, really selling everyone this idea that it was just a invention of democracy. People can spread their voices more, further. And he fell into, as far as the biography's point of view, is he fell into this depression when fascists started to use the electric loudspeaker the most and the best for their messaging.
Right. What the tools will be used for.
Exactly. Yeah. It touted as something that would be democratic and ended up being very, very used very hatefully. And I don't think any decision is made. I think Twitter is obviously much more. Social media is a lot complex creature than the the electric loudspeaker. But I think we're contesting with the fact of who's using it the most and who's using it to the fullest. And you have streams of disinformation versus like streams of organizing. I will say that even myself using social media, that outreaching to historians and other writers and other activists, organizing today, it's been great to see that not being alone is wonderful, but what does that mean when the disinformation is waves and waves? It's a science fiction question. This is something Philip K. Dick would just run around terrified. I think if Philip K. Dick knew that Twitter was going to be a thing, and maybe he did, I think he would have been absolutely mortified. And I told you guys all this. Nobody listened.
It would have been definitely a feature in some novel of his where everything went wrong, and
it's just a wonderful novel of paranoia, probably. But I agree. It's like the past colliding with the future and the present, I think is what these revolutions and what I hope to portray in the novel were about.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we covered probably somewhat an enormous ground there over the last little bit. So that was a great discussion. I just want to always check in. Was there anything else within the book that you really want to get across, or you really hoped people would understand or think about that maybe we haven't had a chance to touch on?
Yeah, and I think built into all this, built into the science and built into the sort of the meaning of history in the book, I think I do think the core of the heart of the book is, I think, listening to other people, which in itself can be a very sort of like simplified way that can have sort of complex ramifications. But, going back to this idea of Studs Terkel giving people space on the page and when he interviewed people, asking the right questions at the right time and allowing them to paint a portrait of themselves, I think it's powerful. I think it really is. I think it's powerful for writers to listen and deal with the material that they hear as opposed to what they assume can be heard. And I also think it's a powerful like organizing tool to allow people to tell their own story and find out ways in which people's stories connect. I think can be one of the most profound things when we sit down with a book, and also when we knock door to door, if we choose to be organizers. So yeah. Listening.
Okay.
It sounds so, it's like our third grade teachers say you have to listen. But also,
right. It sounds quaint, but it's actually crucial to society. Turns out.
I 100% agree with that. Yeah, I think it's a very sounds quick and simplified, but it has powerful ramifications when you take it to heart.
So I love to wrap it up with a quick thunder round. We'll get to know you a little bit, and then we'll call it a day. Sound good?
Cool. Absolutely.
Okay. Here we go. What is your favorite food and or drink?
Oh, this is easy. Sancocho. It's like a beef stew in Ecuador. And my mom has perfected it. My favorite drink. Yeah, my favorite drink, if I'm going to sit down and drink, have a drink with friends, it would be a dark and stormy.
Ooh, okay. I like that. Great. Where is your favorite place you ever been? And we've talked about so many places, and you've been all over.
Well, I have to go back to even when I said about researching for book number 2. Since I've been a kid, I've been very almost wondrously in awe of the Cuyabeno reserve in the Amazon in Ecuador. It's this just enormously, absolutely stunning reserve in the Amazon. And when I go there, I feel at home, and it's absolutely breathtaking. And sort of the biodiversity there is unlike anywhere else on the planet. So it's a home away from home. Even when I'm having rough times, I'll think about it. So the Cuyabeno, the Cuyabeno Reserve in the Amazon for me.
Okay, that sounds amazing. Okay, great. Last question. If you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
Ooh, I like this. The existence of billionaires.
There you go.
I think they're just an aberration, a Frankenstein aberration of capitalism, and the enormous amount of theft and problems and catastrophic inequity that they cause. And I would say no more billionaires. That would be my magic wand.
Okay, that's your magic wand. You get to use it. Okay, fair enough. Well, Michael Zapata, this has been a great conversation. The book again, The Lost Book of Adana Moreau, everywhere you can find fine books. And it was a wonderful read. And thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.